Let's talk about different type of IP addresses a EC2 instance may have. This would depend on the use case of that IP address, whether you would have a private, public or elastic and when to use which one. So I'll try to show this through a demo and that would be much easier for you to understand. IP address is a mechanism by which an instance is identified on the network. Like your mobile have a mobile number, similarly devices on networks have a IP address. IP address is assigned mostly in a automated fashion through a feature which is called DHCP, and you could find that information into VPC detail. So VPCs help you to create a DHCP option set, and through that DHCP option set you could automate the process of distributing IP addresses to the newer machines which are getting ready. So this is my DHCP option set, and through this I could configure what type of IP addresses to, which IP addresses to distribute, what should be the range associated with it. So that is my DHCP option set available here. Now I am trying to now launch an instance so that we can see the various IPs associated with it. So I am on EC2 console and I would go ahead quickly and launch an EC2 instance. I won't modify any of the detail in that. I don't want to do a lot of stuff here. I just want to see how the IP addresses get assigned and how we can change them if the need be. I'd keep everything same. Sorry, everything default. I am Linux 2 is fine. Linux 2 on my instance. T2 micro is fine. Key pair, let's select it. Proceed without key pair, let's still okay. And I would go ahead and say okay, let me launch it. I'm not verifying any further details like it's a security group and all. I'm just launching a plain vanilla instance here. Once this instance gets ready, let's see what happens and what IP addresses get assigned. Now I launch this instance into a default VPC. Default VPC already have subnet, we already discussed that, and those subnet are by default allowed to have public IP addresses. So if my machine is residing on that subnet, it would also get a public IP address. What is a public IP address? Public IP address is a way by which this machine can be accessed from outside world. So an instance always gets something called private IP address. No escape on that. It has to be there. It is a mandatory thing. And depending on which subnet you have launched and what is the setting of that subnet, you may get a public IP address here. But like you see, this is assigned by AWS to my machine when it is started. Now, whether you would get this IP address or not will depend on some of the settings. If let's say I go to a subnet and in that subnet, if I see some, let's say this is the subnet I am interested in, I should be able to see details about whether it would allow public IP address distribution or not. See this option? This is auto assign public IP address. Yes. So if it is and it has access to IGW, then only I would be able to access and get a public IP address on the instances which I launch on it. So by this time my machine should be ready. Let me note down these two IP addresses. I am putting it onto a notepad so you can relate these things once I show how it changes or not. So this one is my private IP. How I can say this is private IP? Obviously it is written here, and private IP addresses are always into a specific range which starts with 172. There is a 192 series, there is a 10 series IP address. These are all considered as private IP addresses. And this one is a public IP address. So if somebody wants to access this machine from outside, apart from VPC, they would be using this public IP address. Right. I haven't selected which IP address would get to my machine. It got automatically associated with the DHCP because of DHCP server setting, which is running in my VPC. Right. Now, let's do one thing. Let's go ahead and shut down this instance and start this instance again. So I'm stopping this instance and I would start it again. Now, while this is happening, think about what would happen. Will both the IP addresses remain same after the start of the instance, or will any of them would change? So first thing I stopped it. It is entering into stopping state. It may take little time, and once it is stopped, I would then start that instance again and we will compare if my IP address change or not. That's why I have noted them down. So there is a public and there is a private IP address, and we will now see what happens once I start this instance again. So it is stopped. Now if you see here, private IP address is still associated, though even the instance is stopped, but public IP address is gone. And then probably you might have guessed by now that this IP address, which is private, won't be changing even if an instance is shut down. And if that instance is started again, this address would remain the same and the public IP address would be allocated again. Hopefully in a minute or so I should be seeing a public IP address. I have refreshed that web page and let's see what happens now. My instance is probably starting, and once it starts it should be able to get a different public IP address. See this time, so this is 34 something. I would copy this thing again. So after restart this IP address changed, whereas the private IP address remained the same. It is unaffected by the power cycle of the instance. Right now, if you want machines to communicate, we can use private, you can use public. Let me give an example here what happens when you are using private or when you are using public. So this is your VPC. Now this is a subnet in that VPC, and on that subnet you have your instances. Let's say there is an instance called A, an instance called B, and they have connectivity like this. Now if both of them have public and private IP address, let's see what happens. Let me use an address here. Let's say just call it 172.x, which is my private IP address, and let me call it 50.x. I'm not writing the whole digit here, which is my public IP address. And here is same 172.x is my private, and I have 30.x, which is my public IP address. Now, if I log into this machine and then let's say initiate some communication from A to B, let's say I just do a very basic test and now I say I want to ping. Ping to whom? I want to ping to the IP address which is in 172 dot something something range. So this is a private communication happening between them. This will happen within VPC. It doesn't need to go out. Right. But if from here, if I say, hey, I want to ping 30.x.x.x address. So this time what is going to happen? Your request will be forwarded to the outside world, which is basically internet. And then from there, it would be again coming back to this machine and it would be responding then. Obviously, you need to open up ports and other configuration, but public IP addresses would be referred through internet, whereas private IP addresses would be accessed internally. And we always have a recommendation that if you want machines to communicate, use private IP addresses. It is much cheaper than using external IP addresses. There is no charge for getting external IP, but once they start transferring the data transfer charge would be added to the to the service, and that's why private charges are less. And if they are within the same availability zone, charges won't be there. But in case you want to use same availability zone machine but with public IP addresses, you would end up paying money on that. Now let me draw this thing again. So what we have, let's consider I have a web server and I have started this web server, let's assume, and it got an IP address, let's say 30.1.1.1. Somehow this web server is shut down and it starts again, and then it will get 40.1.1, let's assume that IP, which means my users here would not be able to access this on 30 now because it is now responding on 40, and that can be really complicated for my users to keep on checking what IP addresses, right? So what we can do in these kind of cases, what if we could have a IP address which is independent of the power state of the machine? So yes, that is possible. What we could do, we could get an IP address and that is referred as something called Elastic IP address. This Elastic IP address is allocated on an AWS account level in a region. So in a region, in an account, you would be asking for an elastic IP address. AWS will give you a specific IP address from the pool it has available, and that would be associated with your account. Once you have that IP address allocated, what you can do later, you can associate it with the instance of your choice. So right now I am associating, let's say, to this web server. If this web server crashes, what I can do now, I could launch another web server and let's call it web2, and the same IP address can be now associated here. So this IP address, let's say, was 60.1.1.1. My user can keep on communicating to 61.1.1 and it can be attached to any of the instances, shouldn't be a problem at all. So that's why we refer that it is elastic. It can be detached and it can be attached if the need be. Obviously, you could automate this process. Maybe you can configure, let me do a health check on this machine, and if this machine fails, we would automatically launch one more and then reassociate the IP address, which is my elastic IP, to the healthy machine and remove that access from the old, or detach it from the unhealthy machine. So it can be automated. It's a very rudimentary way of doing the things. We will talk about something called auto scaling group and load balancer, which will take care of these things in a much modern way rather than detach and attach. But just in case needed, you could have elastic IP address detached and attached. So let me show you this thing here into console. Then I'll go to my VPC section. Here my machine is ready. We can refresh and see what is available now. So my machine is ready and it has some IP addresses as we see both. Now I go ahead on my VPC screen and here I say, hey, I need a elastic IP. Now, if you're doing this you should be aware about the cost associated. It's not huge money, but still there is a cost associated with elastic IP address. Now, cost is not there if it is only attached to running instance. So let me draw that. If you have taken an IP address, elastic IP, and you have kept it attached to a running instance which was in running state, there is no charge on that. But if you shut down that instance, you would accumulate charges. Or if on the same instance you are now saying I would need one more elastic IP on that, so for the second IP you would start paying the money. First IP, if it is attached to the running instance, it is free, but on the same instance if you attach another elastic IP, then there would be charges. Or if you shut down the instance, then the charges would be calculated on elastic IP. Idea here is that AWS doesn't want people to misuse these IP addresses because IPv4 addresses are relatively less in number available now. So they want to ensure that only when you have a use case, you use those addresses, and once your work is done, you are expected to release these IP addresses. If you do not release, then you would start accumulating some charges associated with that. So if you are doing this thing in your own account and you want to be a little bit careful about the money, please release it once your work is done. So I'll go back to my elastic IP address and I would say allocate me an elastic IP address. So from a pool of Amazon's IPv4 address, I should be able to get a IP address available. I would just allocate IP address to myself. This IP address is given to me, like you could see, and this one is currently not associated to anyone. So what I should do now, the next thing I should be doing, that let's take this IP and I want to associate this elastic IP address to whom I should associate it. See this? I could select an instance and then I would have my instance displayed. This IP address is allocated in a region. So your instance may be running in AZ A, B or C, it doesn't matter. It can be associated to any instance within that region. But technically, you could also attach it to a network interface. What if I have a network interface, maybe behind the scene I'm running something else. Network interface are referred as ENI, Elastic Network Interface, so you could associate it. Or even it is possible that within an instance, you may have multiple network interfaces and multiple private IP addresses. So you could say which private IP address would be mapping to this elastic IP address. So allow this elastic IP address to be reassociated. Yes means this can be again reassociated if the need be. And now I say okay, done. And now I am associating the IP address 63 which I received to the 172 private IP address, and we will go back to the console and we'll see what happens. So this association is done. I could go ahead and see here that has been associated. I would go back to my instance. Previously this was the public IP. We have already noted it down into our notepad here. I would go back and refresh this and see what happens. So I refreshed it. I would click on this machine again and see this now. Now here is the indication. If I see a link like that, that is the indication that hey, this is a elastic IP address associated, and I could then track its detail here into my VPC section. Like on VPC management, I could go and track its detail. Shouldn't be an issue. So let it load, but while I can come here, it will also land in the same page. So this is where I could get my details of elastic IP address. Now, whether I shut down the instance or power off the instance doesn't matter. So I would go ahead and I would say, okay, let me go ahead, sorry, here instance state and stop the instance. It is still there. This association is still there, right? So this is my EC2 instance, which is now stopping having a private and a elastic IP address. Now both would persist. They won't be automatically removed from the association, but now I would start getting charges for my elastic IP address. Private IP address, there are no charges, so you do not worry about it. But if you see, though it is stopped, it is still retained with my instance. And if you feel that this instance is not going to be used again, you could go back to your VPC, go to Elastic IP and say, okay, I want to disassociate from this instance now, and this is the Elastic Network Interface done. And now I want to associate it with someone else. It shouldn't be a problem at all. I could reassociate it with someone else. Or once your work is done, the recommendation would be to release this elastic IP address, and then it is going back to the pool where it came from, and I no longer have any charges to pay for this elastic IP address. So remember, elastic IP addresses are associated on account level, and then they are created at account level and then associated at the instance or ENI level. So I have put together this information into a tabular format. Let's go through this quickly. So private IPs are used for internal communication. Public and elastic both can be used for external. Mandatory or optional? Private is mandatory. You can have an instance which would have private IP and may not have public IP. That is completely fine. But vice versa is not true. Private IP is mandatory. When you may not have public IP or elastic IP, probably if you are launching your instance on a subnet, which is your private subnet. So in private subnet, we do not have we do not have public IP. That's why it is my private subnet. So in that case, I would still be having a private IP. After power cycle, private IP remains the same. Public IP gets renewed. Elastic IP still remains the same. We just saw that. Allocation model. Technically, it is allocated to instance ENI. Same thing with public IP. First, it is associated to account allocation happens for elastic IP on account level, and then you associate it with the ENI. That's how the allocation would work. Charges, private IP, no charges. Public IP, no charges for IP addresses. But elastic IP will be chargeable if it remains unused or if you use more than one IP, more than one elastic IP on your instances. So that is hopefully is clear what is public, what is private elastic IP addresses. In next section, we will talk about more networking stuff. So I hope you are learning something new. And if you have any feedback, any suggestions, let me know on the LinkedIn, even if there is no feedback, but if you enrolled the course and you liked it, let me know. Thank you.